Hi, everyone. Welcome to 100 Years of Football in the Middle East, a webinar that's being put on by the Center for International and Regional Studies here at Georgetown University in Qatar. My name is Abdullah Al-Arian. I'm a professor of Middle East history here at GUQ and the editor of the just released volume, Football in the Middle East, State, Society, and the Beautiful Game. I'm very delighted to have with us 5 of the contributors of the fantastic chapters in this volume. So our first panelist is Ibrahim Elhoudaiby, who's a visiting assistant professor of Middle Eastern and Historical Studies at Bard College. He's a historian of the modern Middle East with a specialty in the political and legal history of 19th century Egypt. His chapter in this volume is entitled The National Game, Genealogy of the Egyptian Football League. Next, we have Yağmur Nuhrat, who's an associate professor at Istanbul Bilgi University, Department of Sociology. Her research interests and publications center on the anthropology of ethics and morality, gender and language in football and urban anthropology. Her chapter in the volume is entitled The Trivialization of Women's Football in Turkey. Next up, we have Maher Mezahi, who's an independent football journalist based between Marseille and Algiers. He examines the relationship between sport and politics, and his research interests include North African politics and the history of colonial sport in Africa. He covers North African football extensively, and his work has been published in the BBC, Guardian, Telegraph, ESPN Africa, and Al Jazeera English. In the volume, his chapter is entitled A Study of Football Chants as Political Expression in the Algerian Hirak. Next, we have Simon Chadwick, who's a professor of sport and geopolitical economy at Skema Business School in Paris, where he's also a member of its think tank, Publica, and the director of the school's Global Executive MBA in Sport. He's published numerous books on sports, including The Business of the FIFA World Cup and The Handbook Football Business and Management. For this volume, he authored a chapter entitled GCC Football Fans and Their Engagement, Establishing a Research Agenda. And last but not least, we have Zahra Babar, who's the Associate Director for Research at CIRS here at Georgetown University in Qatar. Her current research interests include rural development, migration and labor policies, and citizenship in the Persian Gulf states. She's published several articles and chapters, most recently, the 2022 World Cup and Migrants' Rights in Qatar, Racialized Labor Hierarchies and the Influence of Racial Capitalism with Mihavora in the Political Quarterly. In this volume, her chapter is entitled Qatar, the World Cup, and the Global Campaign for Migrant Workers' Rights. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. So Ibrahim, I wanted to start with you. So in your chapter, it argues that the formation of the Egyptian League was integral to the contestations of power that culminated in the birth of an independent post-colonial state. Can you tell us a little bit more about the historical context in which Egyptian football became formalized into a league and how it contributed to the struggle for independence?
Thank you, Abdullah. Thanks for having me. And it's good to be here with you again and to meet everyone here again, even if virtually. So the Egyptian League dates back to 1948. In the chapter I wrote for this volume, I focused on the prehistory of this league. So the starting point of my inquiry is sometime in the late 19th century when the British soldiers brought the football game to Egypt following the occupation of 1882. The game at the time was confined to the British, who played in camps and public squares in major cities, while neighboring Egyptian peasants, urban poor, and passers-by watched. It was the game with its clear and elaborate rules stood in stark contrast to forms of play and leisure of Egyptians at the time. The peasant play had no strict rules, record keeping was minimal at best, and playing did not necessarily result in winners and losers. So when these peasants played football, they relaxed the strict rules of the game. There were no strict rules other than kicking the ball, using their feet and attempting to get it between the designated goalposts, while all other rules were really negotiable. This kind of creolized street football had little, if anything, to do with the power contestations. It was only when Effendis or middle-class educated men took interest in football as a platform in which they could assert themselves against the British that football became political. This all started with a game that took place sometime in 1895 between a team captained by Mohammed Effendi Nashid, and an administrative employee at a British military workshop, and the British team. And against all odds, the Egyptian team won. And as soon as the news of this victory became known, Effendis, these middle-class men who had known next to nothing about football, became very proud of this victory over their colonizers. And these Effendis took place in this football game of the British, the one with rules, winners and losers, and they demarcated this game from the street football, upon which they looked down, the football game of the peasants. So they played their football in schools and, more importantly, in clubs. And my chapter is essentially about thinking about the emergence of these clubs as sites of contestation and of consolidating power, especially after the National Revolt of 1919, because prior to this revolt, Effendis who were playing against the British, again, they took no interest in street football, but with the revolt, in which many non-Effendis, women, peasants, urban poor participated, the primary contradiction was no longer between peasants and Effendis, but between the nation and its colonizers. So in other words, it was no longer between street creolized football and the official game, but between the Egyptian football and the British football. Club managers were interested in four things. They were trying to do four things, and that's the last thing I'll say to keep it short. So first, they were trying to establish their control over their teams. Team members were initially just members of these clubs. So there is a long history of managers consolidating power over these teams, transforming these club members into a disciplined football team. They used so many things. I mean, questions of loyalty to clubs versus loyalty to players. They invoked notions of club tradition, club identity, club legacy, but there's also the continuity that comes with clubs being corporations and therefore potentially immortal beings, this continuity that allows for sharing memories across generations. There were also a few regulations that came from the Egyptian Football Association that limited that gave club management power over player. The second thing they were trying to do, so the first was establishing their control over the team. The second was establishing the collective hegemony of club football over other forms of play. Remember, there's this street football, there's this peasant or urban poor football that was, at least in terms of numbers, much more popular than the football game. They adopted multiple strategies so that the club football game would become hegemonic. I mean, we can speak of things like, again, print capital, the impact of radio, of stadiums in which these games were played. In doing so, they had to include also elements from this street football, because contrary to this pre-1919 moment, this is a moment in which the nation is expanding, and in a very Gramscian way, they have to include non-Effendis through a process of maybe Effendiization, the ethics of sportsmanship. They had to be negotiating a place in this emergent nation for non-Muslims, for women, for different elements, different fragments of the nation. And this is a long process that culminates again in the form of football in which we see women being confined to spectatorship, non-Muslims by and large also being confined to spectatorship. So they're part of the nation, but they're not part of the team in a sense. Establishing the third mission, or the third objective they had, was establishing an Egyptian football terrain that now represents the nation. So demarcating, they're no longer playing against the British as they used to do prior to the 1919 revolt. They were establishing a national football domain, but it was not a nationwide domain. They were separate domains in different urban centers that manifested most importantly in these provincial leagues. So the idea of a national league does not really follow from the nationalization of the game. There were these provincial leagues in Alexandria, in the Canal Zone, and in Cairo. These were the three designated zones. But there was also a nationwide competition. That's the Prince Farouk Cup, later King Farouk, obviously. So there was this tension, and this is my last point, tension between these two forms of national football, the provincial one and the nationwide one. And this is the fourth domain of contestation between these club managers who are trying to establish power for their respective clubs. And of course, team managers from these provincial leagues were very skeptical, to say the least, about the emergence of a national league in which they would lose power. But again, thanks to the emergence of the national radio, thanks to the widespread of print capitalism in this period, this gives rise to the National League, which emerges initially as sort of a complementary element of these provincial leagues, but then eventually takes over. I know this is a bit of a sketch of what the chapter has, but trying to stick to the 7 or 8 minutes. So thank you.
No, thank you, Ibrahim. That's really a fascinating study, I think, in terms of giving the overview, and especially I think that really deep history, which seems to be news to a lot of people who, of course, don't see the legacy that football has had in this region. So next, Yağmur, similar kind of question. I mean, so your chapter looks at the trivialization of women's football in Turkey, but I thought maybe you could give us a sense of the historical development of the women's game in Turkey and the conditions that produced football as a space of insecurity and precarity, as you write in your chapter.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by trivialization and what I mean when I say that it is a space of precarity and insecurity, because I do start the chapter with those descriptions. I was able to observe, and I have to say I did this research right before the pandemic. So just as I was wrapping up some of my interviews was when we shut down. So when I was doing this research, I noticed on several scales that women's football was being neglected. It was considered unimportant, just ignored. It wasn't on people's radars. And I was able to observe that on various scales, as I said. For example, I would see that fixtures for games would be announced very late, or they would change, or games would never start on time, and they would be organized on kind of neighborhood pitches where other people would be training in the background. The pitches themselves would lack some basic resources like scoreboards, or there would be kind of outlying goal post running, like lying around. So the scene itself felt like not a lot of people were paying attention to what was going on, or that the whole sphere wasn't kind of organized very carefully. There would be the games would be free, right? There would be no security, which is so different, of course, from men's football in Turkey, that is so heavily policed, that is so heavily controlled by the state, by the police, by all these other agents. So that was like the everyday reminder and everyday indication of this thing called trivialization that I talk about. And then as I started to talk to players, they started to talk about how even in established clubs, the resources allocated to women's football, like training grounds or camps, would be so scarce. Goalies didn't have their own trainers. They were never paid on time. The players would never be paid on time, or not at all sometimes. There was very little media coverage. That is changing, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that later too. Almost no sponsorship deals, and women's football is still to this day excluded from bidding, which you might think, how is that relevant? But a lot of players kept telling me that the media sponsorship bidding triangle really shows how much importance is attached to a particular branch, to a particular event. And once a branch is excluded from that triangle, you really know, you're able to tell how little resources they have. But the largest indication was the absence of professional contracts. So these were players which women's football is still considered an amateur branch. And so the players weren't signing official or legally binding contracts. Some were signing something, but it wouldn't be legally binding. A lot of times they would play on verbal agreements. Of course, this means that they were entirely precarious in the hands of of managers, club administrators. They could easily be fired, rehired kind of arbitrarily. And if they had health issues, that was the largest ramification, was if they had injuries or other health issues, they didn't really have the club to fall back on to take care of them, to have any kind of physical rehabilitation, or even surgeries sometimes could be put off or not paid for. So this is why I thought that they were living in this kind of precarious, insecure space. And of course, all of this is couched, like women's football isn't exempt from a larger kind of sphere of inequality, right? The inequality that I'm talking about here is between men's football and women's football, obviously. And it is you're asking about the historical conditions. The historical conditions basically on the basic historical kind of determinant there is the fact that there is gender inequality in the larger society, right? So women's labor is not valued as much in various sectors and various industries. Women aren't compensated equally in various sectors and various industries, and football isn't exempt from that. So when women do the same thing, they're not going to be paid equally. So that's like a large, as I said, determinant. But with football specifically, what we find around the world in many places, including in Turkey, with a few exceptions, of course, was that football was always considered a men's sport. To this day, it's a masculine activity. It's a masculine sport to play, to watch, to write about, academically. I don't know how many times I had to legitimize the fact that I studied football. Like, I had students who would be incredulous about the fact that they have to listen to football from a woman, right? Because people don't associate women with this sport. As I said, of course, in places like the US, that's different. In some countries in Scandinavia, that's different. But largely around the world and in Turkey, football is a man's activity. So even though there was mention of women's football in Turkey in the late 20s, and even though women did start to organize and organize games and have matches, there was always obstacles. There was always interruptions in the league. There was always prejudices that prevented women from engaging in this sport professionally. And those obstacles are largely social norms, right? The assumption that football is this very kind of aggressive and physically demanding sport, and that women are just simply not strong enough. Women's games were shorter when they first started in Turkey, because women's endurance wasn't considered to satisfy the requirements of a 90-minute game. Women's bodies were considered to be harmed if they engaged in football. So like the assumption was that it would result in crooked legs and even hairy bodies. You might think that that's really laughable today, but there were, and not just in Turkey, I've read in literature, on social science literature on football, that some similar assumptions were held up in places like Brazil, right? A footballing country where you imagine that it might be more inclusive, but that wasn't the case. It was considered a very kind of normatively male space. So women were excluded from it because it didn't fit with ideal femininity. It didn't fit with norms of how to be an ideal woman, how to have an ideal body for a woman, how to engage in the public space as a woman. And that proved that was a very large obstacle. And we do still see reverberations of the same kinds of obstacle today. Still, Girls are able to play on the streets, maybe until adolescence, but once they hit puberty, they are usually prevented by their families to continue playing and channeled into more female sports, quote unquote, like volleyball, gymnastics, things that are considered more apt for women's socialization or women's bodies. So that kind of the way in which sport is gendered, and sport is gendered all over the world in various different ways, and it's gendered in this specific way. Football is gendered in this specific way in Turkey, and so that has been a historical kind of obstacle. And one other thing I want to talk about is even when it is endorsed. So there have been there were, when I was doing my interviews, there were club managers, and you do hear sometimes the federation kind of employing a discourse that supports women's participation. But even when that's the case, and this is also in the literature about women's football in Turkey, even when that's the case, it's always this discourse of instrumentalizing football for a better purpose. So it's this mission almost to save women, to save girls, and to turn football into this kind of social project through which the country or a specific group can achieve modernization or progress or something. And that's very in line with how sport was seen as a vehicle for modernization for Turkey at the foundation of the Republic. Sport and physical training and physical education was seen as a way to cultivate fit individuals for the Republic, and football actually didn't really go hand in hand with that, because team sports encouraged rivalry, and the Republic didn't need that kind of rivalry, but that's just tangential. Women and women's participation in sport were also seen as a particular vehicle to modernization. So women in sport was always instrumentalized. It wasn't something inherent about women's participation in sport. It wasn't a kind of reverence of the intrinsic value of athletes engaging in the sport that they want to engage in. It was more a way to use this as a pathway to achieve a supposedly more kind of virtuous a project. So what I kept hearing from my interlocutors was that when it's young boys, right, when it's youth squads for men's teams, yes, they also suffer from deprivation. Yes, the conditions for them is also not as good as men's professional football for the A teams. But clubs want to invest in them for the sake of investing in them, in their persons, to train them as athletes. But whenever you hear proponents of women's football, it's always as this virtuous goal to save society, to save women, to save, to help, to educate women, right, or to kind of further the supposedly more virtuous civilizational goal. And that's a problem for a lot of women that just want to engage in the sport for the sake of engaging in the sport, and don't necessarily consider themselves as vehicles or instruments of this of this larger project. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now, and then we can continue later on.
Yes, thank you, Yağmur. Maher, shifting things over to you. So your chapter provides a description about the use of different forms of football fan culture in the Algerian Hirak movement of 2019. This includes things like songs, chants, art displays. Can you tell us a little bit about why the popular protest movement relied in particular on symbols of football fandom in its mobilization against the authoritarian regime in Algeria?
Well, I think the main reason for that was really that the protest movement was universal, and there were people from all walks of life that participating in it. And generally, when you have protests like that, you're going to need some kind of unifying factor. And in that sense, song and art and slogans is very unifying. There have been many different protest movements in the history of Algeria, of independent Algeria, things like Tamazight or Berber language rights, things like class uprisings in 1988, things like student protests. But in general, we're talking about factions of the country. We're not talking about the entire country. Whereas this really was, I think, probably for the first time since the Algerian Revolution and from 54 to 62, a time when we had the entire country politically protesting against something. And so I think when you have that kind of universal protest, you're looking for signs of unification. And that came in the form of football fans. So unlike in Egypt, the Egyptian Revolution in 2010, or unlike in the Gezi Park protests in Turkey, we didn't have ultras really on the front lines where they would kind of clash with police and go as an ultra group with their own banners and with their own flags. I spoke to ultra groups in Algeria who said that we are participating, but on an individual basis. We're not instrumentalizing the ultra group for the political protests. But as a result, you had football fans within the protests. They were not necessarily there as the ultra group, but there were many football fans within the protests, and they would be singing their songs. And that's one thing that I really made a lot of effort to sort of outline in the chapter, is that I think North African football fans are the most musical in the world. And I trace this back to the link between football and music in Moorish cafes in North Africa. So in the early 20th century, you had these cafes, and they were very influential across North Africa. So for example, some of the biggest clubs in Africa are named after cafes, like Espérance de Tunis is named after a Café de l'Espérance in Tunisia. And they were often places where these football clubs were founded, but they were, prior to television, there were also places where football fans would go listen, to radio for the results, and they would be mingling with artists. So one of the specific kinds of music we have in Algeria is Sha'bi music. And one thing I outlined in that chapter is how Sha'bi masters would sing for different football clubs. And I think that created a very early link between football supporters and musicality in North Africa. And so as that sort of, as there was a demographic shift in the nature of supporters that go to Algerian stadiums in the 1990s, where really now we're talking about 18 to 35 young men in the stadiums, the music drifted along with it, and the music started to form itself around the everyday troubles that an 18 to 35 young man would have in Algeria. So things like unemployment, things like illegal immigration, things like being frustrated at a calcified ruling class. And as a result, for even leading into the 2019 protests, since really 2014, 2015, a lot of the music that was coming out of Algerian stadiums was inherently political, sometimes explicitly criticizing the Algerian president, former president Abdelaziz Bouteflika, criticizing ruling elites. And this was also the case in Morocco with very famous songs like Fi Bladi Dalmouni, in Tunisia with songs like Yahyatna, which was produced by Club African supporters. And I outline all of this in the chapter. And what they end up doing in the 2019 political protests is they start singing these songs in the protests, and these songs are adapted by all protesters. So it was quite funny because you could have scenes where you have a grandmother singing songs from the stadium, which would never ever happen in any other context. And so as a result, the 2019 anti-government protests were really unifying around songs, chants, tifos, which were choreographic displays that ultras tend to do in well, all around the world really, but I think really started out in the Mediterranean. And so it really had this unifying factor. They used that art to send messages, to unify, and I think that was the main purpose. And that's what I really wanted to outline in my chapter.
Thank you, Maher. So Simon, your chapter offers a really compelling argument about the notion that football fan culture in the GCC should be examined on its own terms, rather than how it measures up to traditional modes of assessing fan culture in other contexts. So thinking specifically about, American or Western European contexts more broadly. So can you share with us why, distinguishing between these different modes of fan culture is necessary, and then maybe also a little bit about what preliminary conclusions you've reached in your study about fan culture in the Gulf region?
Thanks for inviting me to be here and for being able to talk about this and write a chapter. I'm really grateful. I've noted who the attendees are today. And I really wish we had more people from Europe in particular, the kinds of people who typically would make statements like, there is no football fan culture in the GCC, because I think my chapter was in part a response to them. One of the things that you will find if you look in my chapter is I make comparisons between Iran and Turkey, which very clearly do have well-established football fan cultures and are worthy of study in their own right. But I make the comparisons between Iran and Turkey with Saudi Arabia because clearly fan culture is less well established in Saudi Arabia. But nevertheless, if you look at, for instance, the Riyadh Derby is a healthily attended derby, often drawing 50 or 60,000 people to a stadium. And so I guess my first point of entry as a European was to think in terms of this question, or this statement: there is no fan culture. Well, actually, there is a fan culture. It's just that quite a lot of Europeans and possibly people from elsewhere in the global north choose not to think about such issues. So I really wish there were more people from Europe in the audience today. That's the first thing. But then the second reason I've thought long and hard about football fans and why they become fans and how they think and behave as football fans is really my own origins in working in academia in this field. Because if I go back to the mid-90s, and and I'm talking about 1990s as opposed to 1890s, if I think about the 1990s when I first started my university career, I would read a lot of studies about fandom and fan engagement and motives and behaviors related to fandom that was predominantly drawn from North American experiences, and it referred to, for example, the franchise system. And obviously, as a European football fan, I would think about the franchise system and think, well, that doesn't apply in my case. I was born in the town, and so therefore I'm going to die with the team. I remember my father at a very early age saying, right, we're going to go and see the team. And that was it, cradle to grave fandom. And the franchise system, obviously there are cradle to grave North American sports fans that are, cradle to grave. But in a franchise system where your franchise could leave town at any time, the relationship between you and your team is very often different. And this was unusual to me. Also, again, if you consider North American sport, tailgating is a really well-established part of fan culture. Now, when I first saw this term tailgating, I kind of thought, well, what the hell is tailgating? And tailgating basically is you and your friends get into an SUV and you go and drive to the venue, drive to the stadium, park your SUV in the car park, normally about 4 or 5 hours before kickoff. And you have a barbecue and drink beer. And again, that immediately led me to think, well, my football team, there's nowhere to park your car because it's in an urban environment where there are very kind of narrow streets around and there's not much parking space. And so I guess my own origins as an individual, as a European, appear to stand in stark contrast to this prevailing literature, which was predominantly North American. Now, in 1995, when I started out on my academic career, what I didn't realize is that, right, in Algeria, in Turkey, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, there is a football fan culture, and that football fan culture in some respects is different, is similar to, but in other respects is actually different to what you might find in Europe or elsewhere in the world. And my first systematic involvement, I'm not going to use the word science, I'll use the word systematic, involvement in research relating to this. I just jotted down some of the headline numbers that I presented in my chapter. So whilst I was working with the organizers of the Qatar World Cup in 2015, we did some research amongst 1,200 GCC football fans. 73% of them said that football is important to them. 73%. 89%, keeping in mind this is 2015, not now, 89% said they regularly watch football on TV. 78% of them said that they have one favorite local team and one favorite international team. And this was particularly compelling for me because in my case as a European, my team in many ways is the only team. And certainly as an English man, you will find that other English men, typically if they're asked to prioritize their national team and their club team, you will always see your club team. And yet here we are in the GCC, people telling us, well, actually, I've got a favorite domestic club team and a favorite international club team. So that subsequently led me on to thinking about and exploring and working in the field of fan engagement in the GCC. And what I was really surprised to find is that apart from a handful of studies, and we literally are talking about a handful of studies, there is no research on football fan engagement, not just in the GCC, but more broadly in the Middle East. You know, and I put a caveat on that, or kind of footnote on that, in that, you know, in published in English language journals. I realized that there will be studies published in Arabic, and so I think that it is, you know, there is a deficiency there, which I perceived a personal need to try and help fulfill. But I hope that my chapter in some way prompts others to publish, because certainly in my world, and this is my kind of concluding statement. Firstly, in my world, which is in a business school, fan engagement is really, really important. Not just in relation to football or in relation to the World Cup, but across sport more generally, because currently there is intense competition for people's cash. You've got the NBA recently was in Abu Dhabi, and the NBA is trying very hard to boost basketball engagement, fan engagement in the GCC. So too is football. We see this across the world, not just in football, not just in the GCC. And so we live in an attention economy where lots of sports are competing for our cash, and this is really, really important in the current world of sport, because again, seen from a business perspective, with fans comes cash. And there is a view that there is a lifetime of value that can be derived from engaged fans. And this is how commercial sport operates, is that, you know, if somebody like me spends €75 on a replica shirt in year one, you know, do I do that for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years? And I'm also buying other things as well, including tickets. So I do have a commercial value as a fan. And in terms of engaging me in long-term consumption, there is a financial value attributable to this. And if we then think in terms of what that financial value means when paying player salaries, in terms of paying transfer fees, in terms of developing venues and stadiums and so forth, it is an important area. But I guess I'll say a final word. You know, hey, you know, it's really good that there is a handful of studies in this field. I really hope that this English guy researching GCC football fan engagement can serve somehow as a prompt to people within the region studying this. And I guess the final thing to say is, you know, we do share quite a lot as fans. We do share quite a lot, particularly when thinking about fan engagement. But even so, there are some socio-cultural specificities about the Gulf region that means that we do need to know more. As a global academic community, we do need to know more, particularly in business, around fan engagement when we're talking about the GCC, maybe the Middle East, because there are some differences. Although we share a lot, there are some differences, and we need to know what those differences are.
Thank you, Simon.
So Zahra, so you've researched the question of migrant labor in Qatar extensively and have written about it more recently in the context of the World Cup for this volume. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how Qatar's hosting of the World Cup has impacted both the way in which these questions are discussed within Qatar and beyond, but also what practical impact it's had on the question of migrant labor in Qatar over the course of the past decade or so.
Sure, Abdullah. Thank you so much. I think what I might do is actually pick up on a comment that Simon just made, pointing out to the fact that in his field of study, looking at fan engagement, there's a dearth of research, or there hasn't been much work or scholarship on this. I would say that from the field of migration studies and labor migration in particular, that hasn't been the case. I mean, well before 2010, well before Qatar won the bid to host the 2022 World Cup, scholars from across a variety of disciplines, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, had already been doing a focused study of the region, not just Qatar, but the Gulf states, all 6 of them, and not only because it happens to be or had become the 3rd largest hub of global migration by the early part of this century, but because from the middle of the last century, the region has been attracting millions of labor migrants, initially from Arab states, from the larger Arab neighborhood, and then obviously more recently over the last 20, 30 years from parts of Asia and Africa. So when the bid was announced in 2010, what it did was not suddenly make this region interesting to scholars, but what it did was significantly amplify some of what already had been studied and examined, not just by academics and researchers, but of course you had lots of organizations, international organizations interested in migration, different rights-based organizations that had for the last few decades been drawing some attention to the fact that particular ways in which regionally labor migration is structured and managed, and in particular the kafala system, placed migrants in such a deep position of imbalance with their employers, their visa sponsors, that they were likely to face extensive forms of exploitation and vulnerabilities. And so, as I said, there was this body of work which was being further developed, and then the World Cup announcement brought this intense amount of media attention to Qatar for it. But it wasn't as though there was also a lack of awareness in regional governments and even within Qatar. I mean, in 2005, they had started amendments to their labor law. The new labor law actually came out in 2005. And partially as a consequence of the fact that region-wide, like I said, academic and policy interests had focused on problems around labor migration governance, but also because I think Qatar itself was getting to a stage where managing its labor migrant population was becoming problematic. I mean, in 2004, the population of the country was just a bit over 600,000. And by 2011, it had grown to almost 2 million. So it was also the spate of the sort of expanse and change in the demography, so that there was, I think, some internal recognition also that changes would need to be made and labor migration to some extent would need to be addressed. We even have policy reports that were coming out from parts of the government talking about the need to revisit the ways in which labor migration was governed. But of course, this was just of interest to those of us based here or scholars working on the region. And suddenly in 2010, it exploded into something which became of interest to practically every football fan around the world. I do in my chapter spend some time reviewing the reforms that have taken place over the past 12 years. But what I argue is that it isn't as though these reforms occurred in Qatar only and specifically as a result of the World Cup bid, the successful World Cup bid, or because of the international attention that brought to Qatar, but because things are never monocausal, and engaging in reform at a deep level is seldom going to occur in a state unless other conditions are also sort of ripe for those reforms. So partly there were existing pressures, attention drawn to it. Then the World Cup, which of course brought this insane amount of focused attention, complex campaign involving media and many different international organizations, human rights and migrant rights activists. But what I highlight is one of the things that I actually think made reform possible and pushed it through was the blockade of 2017. So that's sort of the third factor that pushed it in. Because, you have different kinds of pressures. You have incremental domestic pressures, which were occurring as the population increased and the sort of private control over managing, self-regulating migrant worker populations was no longer working. You have the focused media campaign coming primarily from Europe. And then you have the fact that suddenly in 2017, Qatar finds itself in a much more immediate and much more challenging crisis, a much more existential crisis, frankly, than an international media and human rights campaign. Based on the actions of its neighbors, not only were there severe consequences, potential threats to domestic security, to its territorial integrity, and not to mention the rupture of diplomatic ties and all, but the neighbors that were engaged in the blockade against Qatar also took on a very extensive media campaign of their own to try and to demonize Qatar, to try and isolate it internationally in a way that Qatar had to try and manage. As a small state, it is reliant on having generally good relations internationally. It needs to have allies. It needs to have a sort of good reputation on the international stage. And so I think at that stage, during the 27 blockade and following it is when we see some of the most deep and more dramatic reforms taking place in Qatar. Current critics continue to say these reforms are not deep enough, but frankly, from where I'm sitting, looking, studying this from 2005 and looking at it today, it looks significantly different, the labor migration system in Qatar. That's when we see a lot of the major post-2017, I think it was in April 2018 that the International Labour Organization was invited to come to Qatar to serve in an advisory capacity and work with the Ministry of Labour closely in starting this sort of process of focused reforms and efforts to dismantle the most problematic aspects of the kafala. So not only was Qatar driven more towards engaging in these because it needed to assume a better global image and sort of position itself as a positive influence in the international arena, but domestic conditions at that point also were very singular. It was in the midst of the rupture of relations with its closest neighbors. You had a domestic citizen population that was rallying around the crown, that was demonstrating very close allegiance to its leadership. And in a way, this also allowed Qatar to push through reforms, fairly unpopular reforms, consistently over the past few years prior to the 2017. Any public opinion surveys that have questioned Qatari citizens about changes to the kafala, reforming the kafala, have mostly been unpopular, particularly among business community and economic community leaders. There was a real sort of antipathy towards any change. So the mood at that moment following the blockade also allowed the Qatari government to push through some of these reforms. Now, I think these obviously we are now in a wait and see period. We're about a year and a half or so into most of these reforms, the minimum wage, the sort of enhanced capacity for migrants to change employers and take up new jobs if they're not happy. We're going to need to track and see. This takes a while to evaluate how significantly it has improved migrants' actual working conditions here. But certainly these reforms have the potential to drive a lot of improvement. The third thing that I'll quickly say is to go back to like what you were talking about in terms of what we had started with, Abdullah, which is the media and advocacy campaign that was focused on Qatar, which actually is then a big chunk of my chapter as well. And although, as I say in the chapter, the campaign is still ongoing, and as we see, it's going on at the moment as well. So it's hard to do a full systematic analysis of this, but I do challenge some of the ways in which it has produced negative consequences as well. Like everything, there's been positive. The media and advocacy campaign and efforts to enhance working and living lives for migrant workers in Qatar. Certainly, one can't say that this is not an important and good thing, and has engaged with these other pressures and conditions, as I mentioned, to produce good change. But unfortunately, there were some ways in which I think this fell short. And I think one of the problems is a lot of the way in which European media in particular spoke about and discussed and presented the labor migration conditions in Qatar. Well, first of all, they were problematic because the ways in which they by fixating consistently on the kafala as some strange, mystifying and distinctly Arab form of governing labor, it served to, first of all, blind people to the fact that the kafala actually has a much deeper history with links to colonial forms of labor production into the region. And it also has many similarities with other contemporary employer-sponsored visa regimes that exist across Europe and North America. And this is not to engage in whataboutism, but it's rather to highlight the very deep and transnational characteristics of this particular population and the vulnerabilities and exposures it contends with. And that Qatar is one very densely packed location where we see this occurring, but it actually occurs in multiple other parts of the world. And rather than, if the media had made a slightly more of an effort to not make it so distinctly about this region and about Qatar, but like this is a big problem, but we're really seeing it occurring in this particular geography, I think it would have sounded less sort of civilizational in tone. And I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Zahra. Turning things back over to you, Ibrahim, in concluding your chapter, you talk about how Egyptian football remained a terrain of political contestation even after the colonial period, so throughout the Nasser era. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what this has looked like in an authoritarian context, whether under Nasser or even if you want to bring it up more recently, up to the kind of Mubarak and now the Sisi eras in Egypt.
Well, I think you'd know more about this than I do. You worked more on this in your chapter than I did, but let me just say a few things about that. I think one of the main points that I'm trying to make in my chapter is that I suggest that we explore the politicization of the game, not only in the relationship between clubs or the formal professional political football scene and the political regime, but that we also, I suggest that professional football is doubly political, so we should explore the politics of the game both inside and outside formal political institutions. We should approach professional football clubs as professional football as a political terrain in its own right. It is a domain in which clubs and associations, which are essentially corporations, play a role in organizing collective life, in forming subjects, and in distributing power. So one thing about thinking about the politics of this terrain while forgetting for a moment about how it relates to the formal political structures in a country like Egypt, we can think of the ways in which these clubs and the regulations around them play a role in disciplining fans. We can think about the rules of the market, which regulate the player transfers. There are also important ways in which these clubs exercise power over street football. Certain values are disseminated in certain ways. I mean, there are also ways in which we can think of how football clubs are platforms in which there are some class contestations taking place. If you think of a club like Ahli, which until the revolution/coup of 1952 was run by pashas and like elites, landed elites, 4 of the 5 last club presidents are former football players. And before that, in the 1950s and 60s, all the way sometimes to the 70s, club presidents came from, by and large, the military and the police. So in general, a better way of understanding the politics of the game is to think more critically. I think about the relationship between street football and the professional football game, to not take the former as sort of a latter, to not take this transition, to not think about it in teleological terms, to think about how other forms of politics are possible, but are undermined by the professional games. I mean, if you look at the ways in which street football is played in Egypt, there are sometimes it's much more attentive to gender dynamics. It's much more attentive to, I mean, questions of equity, questions of cooperation, as opposed to like forms of winning and establishing like victory and whatnot. And then there's the other side of that, which is the relationship between the regime, the political regime, and professional football. And this is a two-way relationship. So the regime uses football to legitimate itself. And this is what you, Abdullah, worked on in your chapter a lot. I mean, there's football becomes a domain that the regime uses for political legitimation. We see how the Egyptian Football Association was chaired by the Minister of War under Nasser, and that right after the formation of the Confederation of African Football, the Egyptian, again, the regime intervened and took over that. There are some other instances of that you cover, I think, in very interesting ways in your chapter, but there is also a way in which clubs draw power from this regime. So after 1952, clubs representing national industries such as Ghazl al-Mahalla, the textile industry in Delta, became important football clubs. In a later stage, clubs representing different state industries, now powerful political institutions such as the military and the Department of Interior, have football clubs that play in the Egyptian Premier League. They want to be part of this scene, basically. It's important for them in different ways. But also club managers, especially very popular clubs such as Ahli and Zamalek, were able to draw on on the power of the political regime to consolidate their power. So in the late 1950s, they were able to strengthen their grip over their players using regime intervention from the state. Also, after the military defeat of 1967, when President Nasser suspended the Football League and the game was dismissed as a distraction from the national obligation of liberating the country and whatnot, Ahli's management mandated that all the club youth join military training camps and encouraged them to volunteer for the military. So the message was basically, football itself may be just a game, as you claim, but the infrastructure that we have for organizing the youth is indispensable. So they were able to capitalize on that to consolidate their power. And my point here is to think of, again, my entire focus on this chapter is on the role clubs are playing in, number one, shaping this landscape, but number two, consolidating their own power. So there's a lot that's going on in this domain.
Thank you so much for that, Ibrahim. So going back to Yağmur, I think, you know, we can all probably agree that we've seen a massive surge in the popularity of the women's game globally, you know, through things like obviously the European, you know, the Champions League, and then more recently the summer's tournament of UEFA, it's kind of the European Cup that was watched very widely. But what do you think the impact has been of that kind of global popularity of women's football in terms of how it's manifested or impacted that level of interest, whether in Turkey specifically or even in the broader Middle East?
Yeah, so absolutely. There's definitely been a surge of interest in women's football lately, and there were some changes that I was observing even as I was doing research. As I mentioned a moment ago, the captain of the national team, for instance, was being profiled by The Guardian. Some players received scholarship to move to the US to play there. Very few people, right? Not like a trend or anything, but There were a few people, and everybody knew them. Like all the players I talked to them knew that this was a potential path that they also could follow to receive more support and to become footballers. Because what I was observing, as I was talking about earlier, was that they had to have second jobs and third jobs, these players, because they just couldn't make enough money playing football. And they were seeing that maybe that may start to change if they're able to make better wages, if they're able to pursue other paths. There were NGOs, there still are sports-related NGOs working on bettering conditions in women's football, some in collaboration with actual players and coaches. So those kinds of collaborations meant that these issues would be more discussed more in civil society, in academia, in these other platforms, again, contributing to changes in the conditions that I was describing. And then after my research, like after I finished my field work and even wrote my chapter, I still kept following these kinds of changes, these impacts, as you say, of popularization of women's football. When I was doing research, only one of Turkey's big three, or Istanbul's big three, had a women's branch, and now Beşiktaş, Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe all have women's teams, and Trabzonspor has a women's team. They used to have a women's team in the past, and then it received no support, no money, no nothing, and so they had to shut it, and now they have it again. So all of these teams, Galatasaray and Fenerbahçe especially, organized a derby like at the Galatasaray Stadium where men play, which was a big deal in terms of visibility, because a lot of times women play, as I said, in these obscure neighborhood pitches, and they are deliberately excluded from men's pitches. That has, I think, a kind of like an ideological component. I won't go there, but the point is that there was a big derby of Fenerbahçe Galatasaray, a women's derby, and it was broadcasted as well. So that's a change. There's more media following. There's more broadcasting of the women's game. The national team has been revamped. They have a new coach who has a social science background as well, who's aware of some of the issues that I just described. There's more sponsorships for the league, for individual teams. So yeah, there are these changes for sure. And as I was talking to some players, some were aware of it and kind of hopeful. Others were more cynical. But here's the thing, like what Simon was saying, right? There's money here. And I think that the UEFA has realized there's money here. The TFF, the Turkish Football Federation, has realized that there's money here. And they've realized that they can use it as a marketing opportunity, basically. So I don't want to end on kind of like a cynical, bleak note. But if you think about the conjuncture within which this is taking place, we can't really pinpoint a kind of upbeat social political conjuncture where things are resolved equality-wise. There's still gender-based violence. Turkey has pulled out of the Istanbul Convention. Women are getting murdered literally every day. There's transphobia, homophobia. There was a parade against homosexuality just a month ago. I mean, violence and fear and these very kind of destructive, harmful sentiments around, let's say, a non-normative gender expressions are still are very, very palpable in this country. So if we see a surge in interest with regards to women's football, it's not really because of changing conditions for equality. It's more because here's a new space through which football can be marketed, more maybe fans can be drawn in, more money can be made for TV, for broadcasters, for federations. Yes, I mean, I don't want to sound entirely cynical. Yes, visibility matters, and yes, all these sponsorships matter, because the absence of them, I talked about their absence as proof of trivialization. So yes, it matters, but it doesn't index, or it doesn't translate to, let's say, more grounded changes in the social and political conjuncture. So to wrap it up, I definitely think that we'll see an impact in terms of popularity, sponsorship, support, things like that in Turkey and other places in the Middle East. But what that means really is a whole other issue. I think that needs to be investigated with nuance and really carefully.
Thank you. So just for the sake of time, I see we have a lot of questions here from our audience, so we'll get going with those now. The first question comes from our colleague, Daniel Raisha, who's also written in the volume. And so he asks, Ibrahim, is there World Cup fever in Egypt? Although the country did not qualify for the World Cup, is there pride that the first Arab World Cup is being staged in Qatar? And then he also asks, actually, since Algeria also did not qualify, the same question that he asked Ibrahim, he'd like Maher to answer as well. So maybe Ibrahim and Maher, you can both take on this question of kind of what is the view from Egypt and Algeria toward this upcoming World Cup?
I mean, I cannot really speak authoritatively on that. Egypt has not quite. Is there fever? Yes, of course there is. I mean, there's a lot of people watching the World Cup, but whether or not there is pride in Qatar hosting the World Cup is a big political question, I think, and it has to do with the now normalized relationships between Egypt and Qatar, but there's still a lot of tension. So, I mean, judging by, I'm not in Egypt at the moment, and judging by the talk shows, there's a lot of confusion. So if you watch some of the mouthpieces of the regime, one day they would be very excited about, you know, the Arab Cup that took place in Qatar last year, with all these national anthems being sort of interwoven together, and then on other days they would be very critical. So if Qatar wins a game or does something good, that's good for all of us. Whenever Qatar loses, that's of course something to celebrate as well, and it's a victory for the Egyptian regime. So, you know, there's all this, they're not very comfortable in their skin at the moment, and they don't know how to deal with this without also provoking some of the other regional sponsors or allies or sponsors.
Yeah, in Algeria, we don't have the exact same political considerations as Egypt and Qatar. In fact, under this new president, Abdulmajid Tebboune, Algeria and Qatar are actually getting along very, very well. I think they've announced just a few weeks ago that they're going to build an Algerian Qatari hospital in Algeria. And they're also, I believe, opening up a steel company. And Qatar offered Algeria a free stadium in a western province of Bilgi. All of this in the last 3 weeks or so. So people don't really have that. There's no political consideration. So it's, I think, more of a pure question to ask: are people excited despite the fact that they haven't qualified? And I would say that actually, yeah, I haven't seen. I mean, I've been in Algeria during the 2018 World Cup, during 2014, just for a little bit of it. And I've never seen as much on-the-ground advertising. So going to malls, you can see, for example, a small example is like the Panini stickers, for example. I'd never seen those before. This year, it's definitely the case. You see like a presence of Qatar 2022 in the shopping malls. I don't think a European World Cup or a South American World Cup would have had that kind of reach on the ground in Algeria. One thing that I can say is that, well, I mean, part of the question was, is this like, are they excited because it's an Arab World Cup in that sense? I think the fact that Qatar is hosting, and the fact that, like, for example, Morocco and Tunisia especially have massive diasporas in Qatar, especially Tunisia, I think that's going to add an element to all of this. So 30,000 Tunisians, I believe, in Qatar. I believe 15,000 Moroccans in Qatar as well. They're going to have that kind of home support at home. I think that can make a big difference on the pitch. But even the Algerians that I spoke to, I was there a few weeks ago, in Qatar were saying that they plan on going to the matches and supporting the Tunisians and the Moroccans and the Qataris and the Saudi Arabians as well. So I do believe there is that little bit of pan-Arab element within the Algerian support. They do feel excited for it, even though they're massively, massively disappointed that they didn't qualify. And finally, just to finish with this, I think what all of us probably know is that there is kind of like a north, south, east, west divide when it comes to boycotting this tournament at all levels, from federations down to supporters. I'm in WhatsApp groups like Inside African Football or Soccer in Africa, where it's journalists talking to one another. I'm speaking to people from Ghana, from Cameroon, from Senegal. People are just simply not, unfortunate. I mean, take it how you will, but they're not really concerned with labor issues as much as, especially the Northern Europeans seem to be, seem to be. So I remember like a few weeks back or a few months back, a lot of media outlets reaching out to me saying, are there fan movements protesting the World Cup in your region, on your continent? And I've asked around and there simply isn't. So I saw CONMEBOL, for the South American Confederation, today adopted FIFA's most recent position of kind of saying, let's focus on the football, let's focusing on what can unify us as well. So you have South America, you have Africa, you have Asia sort of preparing for this World Cup, but when it comes to Europe and North America, that's when we're seeing a lot more criticism.
Thank you, Maher, for that context. Yağmur, I saw that you answered this question in the chat. I don't know if people have access to it, so maybe you can do it live as well. But this question is asking that in men's football, Turkey often reaches out to its German diaspora. Is this also happening in women's football?
Yeah, just very quickly to save time, no, because it's not a lucrative business, and I don't see any incentives for women in Europe, not just in Germany, in Belgium, Holland, all these other places that the men's football recruits from. I don't see any incentive that they would have to come play in Turkey. One thing though, I did interview, this is interesting now that I say that now that I give the answer, no, I did interview a woman who was in her 50s now, who used to play in Turkey back in the day. But she's not a part of the diaspora. She's a Dutch woman that ended up in Turkey, ended up playing in Turkey. But no, there isn't the same kind of mining for talent in the same way, simply because I don't think, again, it's as lucrative as men's football is.
Yeah, Simon, there's a couple of questions here, so I'll put both of them to you, and you can kind of divide up your time accordingly. The first question asks, FIFA promotes political and religious neutrality and is against manifestations of a non-sporting nature. Yet we all know that in 2010, South Africa was chosen as a site of the World Cup competition in large part because it was a democratic regime. It is hard to maintain this neutrality rule, isn't it? And the second question is, will the global attention shift from Qatar to Saudi Arabia after the World Cup, given that KSA is becoming so heavily invested into sports?
Okay, so two very short questions there that demand very short answers. Not. Daniel, I think you know my view on Saudi Arabia. We're hearing rumors, and there are already reports that Saudi Arabia will bid for the right to stage the 2030 World Cup, a joint bid involving Egypt and Greece. And what I find particularly interesting about this proposed bid is that Saudi Arabia, the government is seeking to position the country as an Afro-Eurasian hub. And this, playing into some of the discussion that's already taken place today, there's a great deal of kind of concern and maybe criticism too among some people in the global north, particularly in Northern Europe, around the increasing prevalence of money from Saudi Arabia and from Qatar, Abu Dhabi and elsewhere, and its influence on football. But for me, what I think the kind of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Greece, Afro-Eurasian hub bid illustrates for me is it's not about sport washing, and it's not about image and reputation. It's about countries thinking strategically about who they are and where they seek to be and what they seek to do, and then deploying their resources, and obviously not inconsiderable resources, to create strategies that take them towards realizing the visions that they have created. And you know, as a European, although I know one of the audience has said don't talk about Europe, what I think we've got to understand from a European perspective is that we neither have the resources nor the intentions to be able to do what Saudi Arabia is doing. And so rather than labeling what a country like Saudi Arabia is doing as something other than an economic or industrial investment, maybe a political investment too in its future, you know, that's what it is. You know, it's not something else. That's what it is. And there is an intention, and there are the resources, and clearly countries like Saudi Arabia, and for that matter Qatar, do conceive of football and the World Cup and other events in sport as being the means through which to deliver on strategy and vision. This is something that people from my part of the world have really got to get their heads around, because at the moment, I think the debate is hugely reductionist, incredibly naive, and dare I say, ignorant in some cases. Around neutrality, it's just football, right? You know, as a kid, I used to kick a ball in the street. That's for me what football is, kicking a ball in the street. And so I do, you know, I really have a great deal of sympathy for FIFA. You know, ultimately, it's the global custodian of the world's favorite game. And I think in one sense, what FIFA is trying to do is to keep us kind of focused on this very simple fact. But at the same time, obviously, we do live in a very complicated world, and geopolitically, it's hard to preserve that neutrality. But one thing that's not very often talked about when FIFA makes statements like this, FIFA's protecting its franchise. So there are broadcasters and sponsors and other commercial partners, suppliers, advocates, influencers, and so on and so forth, for whom, if this tournament is disrupted, or if a tournament is boycotted, or if games are postponed because of a spontaneous display of activism, then those it's got contracts with, you know, particularly the international broadcasters, will litigate against FIFA. So I think FIFA is, you know, at one level is trying to, you know, remind us it's just a game, but they're also trying to navigate a geopolitical minefield. But at the same time as well, there's a hard bottom line here, and the hard bottom line is, you know, potentially they could lose money, there could be litigation, and FIFA would be on the end of this.
Simon, and just to your first point, I think, you know, all Liverpool supporters today are holding their collective breath with the news that FSG is just supposedly putting up the club for sale. And of course, now all eyes are shifting toward this region.
Does Liverpool even have a team? I didn't know that. So, yeah, my team interests lie elsewhere.
We'll leave that aside for now. But so Zahra, the next couple of questions are for you. Again, I'll try to sort of combine these. First, you know, do you think the reforms will continue after the World Cup? And the second question, I appreciate the abolishment of the kafala system. It's been a great development, but it is still illegal for migrant laborers to form or join a labor union. Surely much more needs to be done in terms of labor law reforms.
Yes, I'll answer both of those, I think, jointly. My own take on the reforms to date is that I think because I believe that the reason Qatar undertook these reforms is for larger structural reasons, because and those will not go away. The World Cup and its spotlight and the media campaign that's focused on Qatar will certainly diminish, even though there are many activist organizations out there, international human rights organizations, who have publicly stated that they are going to maintain close focus and watching what evolves in Qatar. The fact is, those international human rights organizations develop and build and their campaigns based on their stakeholders, their interests, the sources that support them. And though the interest in this will diminish, and so those campaigns will also diminish. But Qatar relies, as I believe, on its good relations with a lot of countries for its economic and trade relations. Its political and security relationships are critical. These conversations around migrant labor rights and reforms of labor migration have become integrated in many of its now foreign policy and international relations with other governments. So I think it'll be very difficult to roll back from these. On the other hand, as in any other situation at a national level, at a domestic level, when you roll out reforms, you see how your policy is evolving, and you may well have to tweak it here and there if you end up finding that it's not working for your political economy. So I'm not suggesting that they absolutely won't change certain things. There has, for example, already been an impact of the changes to the kafala, with many migrants choosing to leave their places of employment, and complaints coming from smaller companies, in particular, smaller meaning, these mid-level companies with workforces of a couple hundred people who are facing very high turnovers. That all they need to do is improve their working conditions, hopefully. But the fact is, if there's a lot of pressure that comes from the economic sectors, the business sector, they might tweak things. In terms of larger, broader transformation of how the labor rights are managed in Qatar, of course, there would always be further things that need to be done if we want to live in societies where labor, and particularly low-skilled labor, is valued. But the fact is, it's devalued globally. In Qatar, there are no real unionization laws even for citizens, let alone foreign workers. And they have made obviously certain attempts with these. Now it's mandated that all workplaces have to have some form of organization where workers' voice is represented and migrant labor's voices are represented. Doesn't exactly fill the role of a union, but I don't see that happening. I mean, in terms of whether that's an aspirational goal or not, I don't see that happening. And that's not just a Qatar problem. Globally, it has been extremely impossible for many countries to provide full unionization for temporary migrants. Temporary labor migrants globally are in a position where they have very little voice in their workplaces.
Thank you. And a question to Ibrahim. How do you assess the role played by established clubs like Al-Ahli in fighting racism?
That's again a tough question. I think the question of racism is a very big question in Egyptian football, even though it is not sufficiently addressed at all. Let's think of, again, the history of one club like Al-Ahli. Ahli's fans, and I personally support Ahli, just to be clear on that, have been chanting racist slurs against some of the players in the main rival, Zamalek. And this happened repeatedly. There were always sort of some critical voices who would say, this is unacceptable, we shouldn't be doing this, we shouldn't be doing that. But no action, and that's the most important point, no action has been taken ever against the club, against its fans, against the specific people who committed that, ever, right? And there's always way of defending that, like he provoked the fans, right? One can draw very clear analogies with like cases of sexual harassment and whatnot. But then just a couple of years ago, Al-Ahli hired a South African manager, Pitso Mosimane, and at this point, the club's administration came under attack using the very same weapons, right? Why do we, the masters of Africa, as many Egyptian sports writers would put it, need to rely on an African coach? We're so used to hiring European coaches. That's what we do. On a civilizational hierarchy that is transformed into a football hierarchy, of course we can learn from the Europeans, but we teach the Africans. This is how Egypt has positioned itself since the early 20th century with the mandate system, actually. This is how Egypt has positioned itself. So Ahli, this very same administration had to now launch sort of a strong anti-racist campaign. And I was like, this is unacceptable. We're part of Africa. I mean, Egypt being part of Africa, and I'm sure Maher can speak about that from outside Egypt, and like what the place of Egyptian football in Africa and the place of North African football in Africa more generally. So what I can say is that there are no principled stances, to say the least, against forms of racism and discrimination in Egyptian football. This is all dealt with. It's part of basically who can do what and who can get away with what in terms of club power. And it is not, and that's, I think, the sad part of it, it does not seem to be an important question for the fans, actually, or for those in charge of organizing the game in Egypt, which again goes back to the politics of the game and what's okay and what's not okay, and thinking about this as a terrain and it's all right, as a domain in which subjects are formed. Right?
So I'll ask one last question here from the audience, and this is for everyone. Do the panel think that a successful World Cup in Qatar could create a future legacy of fandom where football becomes an important part of Middle East culture? I expect, I know what everyone is going to say of this, but maybe we can just take some quick thoughts with the last kind of 3 minutes that we have here. Maher, would you like to get us started with this question?
Yeah, I mean, and Simon spent, I think, the first 5 minutes of saying that there obviously there is a footballing culture here, and I think anybody that's been to the MENA region can speak to that. I could even draw a distinction between the stadium-going culture and fan culture, because I know on Saturday nights, people are watching Real Madrid and Barcelona and Paris Saint-Germain. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to the stadium, but they are football fans consuming football to an extent. And then I would also say that, just to finish with this, a successful World Cup, what does that mean and to who? I mean, I think everybody's going to have varying definitions of what a successful World Cup would be. I think, again, I don't like to keep going back to this divide of north, south, east, west, but I think for many people, especially in the Scandinavian countries, in North America, I think there's no way that there could be a successful World Cup. People at least claim that they're not going to engage with it, claim that they're not going to watch it. So for them, no matter what happens, it'll never be a successful World Cup. But I do think that this World Cup happening in Qatar is a seminal moment for the MENA region. I think it'll prove that we can host these mega global major events, and that I think that's a feather in the cap of a country like Qatar. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Anybody else want to chime in on this note? Simon, please.
I mean, first thing is to say thank you to Georgetown for inviting me several times to be in Doha. But more than that, I want to say thank you to football, because football has been the lens through which my understanding of the MENA region has matured. And I think, you know, the point just made about you know, what's success and how will people around the world, you know, view success and what will they think about it. I genuinely and sincerely hope that the impending tournament provides a positive representation of the MENA region, and that at least some, I know there are people in the world who are not going to change their opinions. In fact, their opinions are going to become even more vehement and more stringent. But I hope at least that the attitudes and behaviors of some of the people around the world, particularly critics, is changed by what's going to happen over the next 6 weeks.
Does anybody else want to offer any final thoughts? Yeah, Ibrahim.
Yeah, just again, thinking back through the last question that I had that I was asked, I think a successful World Cup for me as an African in this case, would have less to do with the way Qatar is organizing it, and would have much more to do with like a team like Senegal proceeding to maybe the semi-final or whatnot. This can change again some of the dynamics of the politics of the game in Egypt, and what's acceptable and what's not, and having like reflecting on, again, some humility for the way Egyptians, but I can also speculatively say North Africans in general see their position in the continent.
Yağmur, would you like to offer any final thoughts?
Sure. I mean, it's a mega event, and so obviously it is bound to have an impact, right? There's a lot of literature on mega events and how they impact the conjuncture, the sociopolitical urban conjuncture in which they take place. It will impact the urban, how it's experienced. It will impact infrastructure, how it's used, subverted, repurposed. It will impact labor rights, as Zahra was talking about. It will impact representation, as Simon is talking about, and it will impact fandom as well. For sure, it'll have an impact. So, as Maher said, clearly there's already fan cultures, diverse fan cultures, and I'm unable to project, to be honest, in which way those will be impacted, but for sure, on multiple aspects, there will definitely be an impact. Whether or not it's successful, whatever that means, there will be impacts for sure.
And Zahra, final word to you.
Yes, I mean, what I really hope is that all the negative attention that Qatar has gotten for this doesn't diminish other countries in other parts of the world wanting to bid for this in the future. Because I think one of the things is we need to put the world in the World Cup. And that means it's not Europe's World Cup. It's a World Cup that does represent all of us in multiple parts of the world. And we have to have a way of embedding that into this football tournament. If it's only going to be something that can never be properly hosted in the Americas and in Europe, then it's not a World Cup.
Thank you, Zahra, and thank you to our fantastic panelists for your time this evening. I think that was really lively and enriching and educational for all of us. Thank you to those who've attended, and thank you to the CIRS staff for pulling all of this together and really kind of having a wonderful panel. We will see you in the next event. So please watch this space. CIRS will continue to plan many events both around these events, this World Cup, but also beyond. So please check those out going forward. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks.